She was 7 years old, standing alone in the middle of a highway, both arms raised above her head. The motorcycles were coming fast, 8 of them. The ground shook beneath her sneakers. The sound was enormous, the kind that tells every instinct in your body to run, not stand still. But Lily Harper didn't move. She had crossed a field alone, squeezed through a broken fence, and planted herself in front of something that most grown adults would have walked away from. Not because she wasn't afraid, because there was someone on the floor of the yellow house behind her who couldn't wait. The lead biker saw her. He slowed, and nothing that came next was what anyone expected. The town of Clarkfield, Tennessee, sat tucked between 2 low hills, like something the rest of the world had quietly forgotten. Highway 70 ran along its eastern border, a grey ribbon of asphalt carrying strangers through at 60 miles an hour. People who never slowed down, never looked left toward the cluster of small houses, the gas station with the broken neon sign, the diner where the coffee was strong and the conversations were short. Most of Clarkfield's 400 residents had grown used to being overlooked. Some of them, over the years, had started to overlook each other too. Lily Harper didn't know any of that yet. She was 7 years old, which meant the world was still made of things like the smell of pine needles after rain, the particular orange of Tennessee sunsets, and the way her mother's voice sounded through the wall at night, low and steady, like a radio left on for comfort. She knew the cracked sidewalk in front of their house like a map. She knew which neighbors had dogs and which ones had wind chimes. She knew that if you stood at the end of Birch Street and looked east long enough, you could see the headlights of the trucks on Highway 70 moving like slow-burning stars. Their house was a 2-bedroom rental on Birch Street, 3rd from the end. Sandra Harper had moved them there 3 years ago after a difficult chapter she rarely spoke about. A divorce, a job lost, a fresh start chosen because the rent was low and the elementary school had decent reviews online. She worked double shifts at the Millway Distribution Center, 6 miles outside of town, folding herself into the early morning darkness before Lily woke up most weekdays, leaving breakfast covered in plastic wrap on the kitchen counter and a handwritten note always ending with "Love you to the moon." A neighbor's teenage daughter, Priya, watched Lily on those mornings until the school bus came. But that Thursday in late September, Priya had called in sick. Sandra had arranged for Lily to go directly to Carol Simmons' house next door and wait there until the bus arrived at 7:40. Carol was 60 years old, white-haired, and lived alone in the pale yellow house that always smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paperbacks. Most people on Birch Street found Carol difficult. She didn't wave when you waved first. She let her grass grow 2 inches too long before mowing it. And she had a habit of watching the street from her porch with an expression that could be mistaken for disapproval. People had mostly stopped trying. But Lily liked her. She liked her because Carol always answered questions honestly, without the softening that adults usually applied when talking to children. She liked her because Carol had a ceramic rooster on her windowsill that she let Lily name. Lily had chosen Captain, and because Carol laughed at things that weren't particularly funny to anyone else, sudden and genuine, like it surprised her too. That Thursday morning, Lily walked through the gap in the fence that connected their yards, stepped onto Carol's porch, and knocked twice. No answer. She knocked again. The front door, she noticed, was open a crack, not wide, just a sliver, the way a door looks when it hasn't been properly latched. Through the gap came the smell of coffee, burnt and old, the kind that happens when a pot is left on too long. Lily frowned. Carol had mentioned just 2 days before that she'd been feeling dizzy when she stood up too fast. She'd said it plainly without worry, the way she said most things. Just old age being rude, she'd said, and laughed her surprised laugh. Lily pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The living room was dim, curtains still drawn. Captain the ceramic rooster watched from the windowsill. The television was off. The kitchen light was on. "Mrs. Carroll?" Lily called softly. She walked toward the kitchen. Carol Simmons was on the floor. She was lying on her side near the table, one arm folded beneath her, the other extended toward the cabinet as if she had reached for it on the way down. Her eyes were closed. Her chest moved. Lily could see that, and the relief of it hit her so hard she had to press her hand against the wall. She was breathing, but she did not respond when Lily crouched beside her and touched her shoulder. She did not respond when Lily called her name 3 times, each one louder than the last. The coffee pot on the counter had boiled dry. The red light still burned beneath it. Lily stood. She looked at the telephone on the wall, the old kind, with a cord. She picked it up and heard nothing. She pressed the buttons. Still nothing. The line was dead. She didn't know why. She only knew it was. She ran back through the living room, out the front door, and onto the porch. Birch Street was quiet. It was 7:05 in the morning. She looked left, then right. The nearest house with a light on was the Garfields at the far end of the block, but she'd tried their door once before, during a thunderstorm, and no one had answered, even though she could hear the television inside. She thought of her mother's note on the counter. She thought of Carol's chest moving up and down. She ran toward Highway 70. The field between Birch Street and the highway was a stretch of yellow-brown grass, late-season wildflowers bent at the stem, and a rusted fence with one post leaning at a permanent angle. Lily knew the gap where the wire had been bent back. She'd found it months ago and had never told anyone, treating it as her private geography, the kind of secret that felt important without being dangerous. She squeezed through now without slowing down, her sneakers catching in the grass, her breath already ragged. Highway 70 at 7 in the morning was not empty, but it was not busy either. The light was still thin and golden, angled low from the east, making long shadows of every car and telephone pole. Lily reached the shoulder and stopped there, on the gravel just past the white line, watching the road. A pickup truck passed without slowing, then a white sedan, then a delivery van. None of them saw her, or if they did, they didn't stop. She thought about Carol's hand stretched toward the cabinet. She thought about the silent phone. She thought about how long it might have been. Carol had probably made that coffee the night before, which meant she might have been on that floor since last night, since before Lily had gone to sleep on the other side of the fence. The thought made her stomach hurt in a way that had nothing to do with being hungry. She heard them before she saw them, a deep rhythmic rumble, layered and multiplied, rolling up from the western curve of the highway like the sound of distant thunder that doesn't stop. Then they appeared. A line of motorcycles, 8 of them, moving in loose formation, wide and steady, the lead bike slightly ahead of the rest. Their engines were a sound you felt in your chest before you processed it in your ears. Lily stepped off the gravel and onto the asphalt. She did not wave. She did not jump. She stood in the right lane of Highway 70, both arms raised above her head, palms flat and open. The universal sign she had seen in movies when someone needed a car to stop. The gesture that meant, "Please, I need you to see me." The lead motorcycle slowed instantly. The others behind it followed in sequence, a practiced accordion of braking, tires grumbling against the pavement, engines dropping from a roar to a low, warning idle. The line of bikes came to a stop about 30 feet from where Lily stood. For a moment nobody moved. The man on the lead bike was very large. That was the first thing. He wore a black leather vest over a dark grey long sleeve, and his arms, resting now on the handlebars, were covered to the wrists in ink, blues and blacks and greens that Lily couldn't read from this distance. His beard was salt and pepper, his eyes were dark, and when he pulled off his helmet, his expression was not angry, but it was not soft either. It was the expression of a man trying to understand something that didn't fit into any category he had prepared for. He looked at the small girl, standing in the middle of the highway, with her hands above her head, and something shifted in his face. He swung his leg off the bike and walked toward her. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, careful. "Hey, you okay? I need help." Lily said. Her voice didn't shake. She had decided on the way across the field that she was not going to cry, because crying took time. My neighbor is on the floor and she's not waking up and the phone doesn't work and nobody's home. The man, Rex Calloway, though she didn't know his name yet, stared at her for 2 full seconds. Then he turned back toward the group. Dwayne. A second man was already off his bike, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a red bandana tied at his wrist. He jogged forward at a pace that surprised people who saw it the first time, quick and purposeful, the kind of movement that belonged to someone used to emergencies. This kid's got a neighbor down. Call 911. Rex looked back at Lily. How far? Through the field, Birch Street, the yellow house. Rex looked at the field, at the bent wire fence, at the space beyond it. He looked back at Lily. Can you take me there? She nodded and turned around. He followed without hesitation. Behind them, Dwayne had his phone to his ear, already giving the cross street to the dispatcher, steady and accurate. The other 6 bikers had pulled their machines to the shoulder and killed their engines. 2 of them stepped off their bikes and watched Rex cross the field behind a 7-year-old girl in a purple jacket, and not one of them said a word out loud. But more than one of them watched with something quiet moving across their faces. Rex was not a small man, and the gap in the fence was not generous, but he went through it without slowing. On the other side, he straightened up and kept pace 2 steps behind Lily, matching her route across the dry grass with the focused attention of someone who has decided a thing and is now simply doing it. What's her name? He asked as they walked. Carol, Lily said. Carol Simmons. She lives alone. Her husband died. Rex said nothing to that. She knew my name before I told her, Lily added after a moment. When we moved in, she came to the fence and said my name, and I didn't know how she knew it. She paused, navigating a rough patch of ground. I asked her later, and she said she'd been paying attention. She said most people don't bother. Rex absorbed this without comment. They reached the gap in the yard fence, crossed into Carol's yard, and went up the porch steps. Lily pushed the front door open, and Rex ducked through it into the dim hallway, already moving toward the kitchen light. 3 houses on Birch Street had people in them that morning. People who were awake, who had heard the motorcycles come to a stop on the highway, who had moved to their windows with the particular alertness of small-town residents who recognized the sound of something unusual. Margaret Foley, age 52, looked out from behind her kitchen curtain and saw a large man with tattoos on his arms crossing the field behind a small girl. She felt a cold twist of alarm and picked up her phone to call someone. She wasn't sure who, then stopped, watching, not dialing. Old Pete Garfield, age 70, stood at his front window with a mug of decaf and watched the man duck through the gap in the fence. He recognized the purple jacket. That was Sandra's girl. The girl who lived next door to Carol Simmons. He set down his mug. Inside Carol's kitchen, Rex Calloway crouched on one knee beside the woman on the floor. He had completed a first aid course 3 years ago, required for the volunteer work his club did at the Veterans Center in Knoxville. He placed 2 fingers at Carol's neck and found a pulse. Faint but steady. Her breathing was shallow. Her left arm, when he checked, seemed to have been beneath her, long enough to have lost feeling. There was a small bruise forming near her temple where she had made contact with the edge of the cabinet on the way down. She's alive, he said. Lily, standing in the doorway, let out a long, slow breath. Has she been sick? Rex asked without looking up. She said she was dizzy 2 days ago. She called it old age being rude. He almost smiled at that. Almost. He turned Carol carefully onto her back, supporting her neck, speaking low and even into the room, not to Lily, not to Carol, but to himself, the way some people think out loud when they need to stay calm and focused. Okay, pulse is there. Breathing, no obvious fracture. Need to keep her still. His phone buzzed. Dwayne's text, EMS 4 minutes out. He texted back, Birch Street, yellow house, 3rd from the end, possible stroke. He sat back on his heels and looked at Lily. really looked at her. She was small, smaller than he'd registered on the road, with an expression on her face that was trying very hard to be brave and mostly succeeding. She stood with her hands at her sides, not fidgeting, not crying, watching Carol with a focused calm that most adults in the same room wouldn't have managed. "You did good," he said. "Is she going to be okay?" "I don't know," he said. He didn't say probably, or I'm sure she will, because it wasn't the truth, and she was looking at him like she would know the difference. "But she has a pulse and she's breathing and the ambulance is 4 minutes away. That's a lot better than it could have been." She nodded, absorbing this with the same steadiness she'd applied to everything else since he'd met her 18 minutes ago on a highway. From outside came the sound of footsteps on the porch steps. Pete Garfield appeared in the doorway, out of breath from crossing his yard at a pace his knees weren't accustomed to. He looked at Carol on the floor. He looked at Rex. His expression passed through alarm, through suspicion, and arrived somewhere closer to controlled grief. "Lord," he said quietly. "You know her?" Rex asked. "Known Carol 30 years. Pete stepped into the kitchen, careful, like the room was fragile. Her husband passed 4 years ago, her daughter's in Oregon. Her son's in Dallas. She never wanted to be a burden. He said the last part like it cost him something. She never would call." Rex said nothing to that. He looked at the coffee pot on the counter, at the burnt bottom visible through the glass carafe, at the red light still glowing beneath it. He thought about how long the light would have to burn before someone noticed. He thought about the answer to that question, and it wasn't comfortable. The sound of a siren reached them from the direction of the highway. Lily walked to Carol's side, sat down cross-legged on the floor beside her, and took the older woman's limp hand in both of hers. She held it, not speaking, not crying, just holding on with the simple and absolute certainty of a child who has decided that presence matters and is acting on that belief without requiring anyone to confirm it for her. Rex watched her do it and felt something shift in his chest, an old feeling he hadn't expected to find on a Thursday morning in a town he'd been passing through without intending to stop. He had a daughter. Her name was Maya. She was 8 years old and lived in Knoxville with her mother, and he saw her every other weekend and on holidays. Maya had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and a laugh that sounded exactly like the one he'd lost somewhere in his late 30s when life got complicated and heavy in ways he still struggled to name clearly. He watched Lily hold Carol's hand and thought about how many times he had driven Highway 70 without looking left. The ambulance arrived at 7:31 a.m. The 2 paramedics, a young woman named Tess and a man named Harold, who had worked the Clarkfield route for 11 years, moved through Carol's front door with their equipment in under a minute. Rex stepped back against the wall to give them room. Lily was gently guided to stand in the doorway by Pete, who kept his hand on her shoulder in the quiet, steady way of someone who had been a grandfather for 12 years and understood that sometimes a hand is the most useful thing you can offer. Harold took one look at Carol's presentation, the dropped left corner of her mouth, the unresponsive left arm, the bruise at her temple, and called it over the radio before they'd finished the full assessment. Probable ischemic stroke, onset unknown, extended time on floor. They worked quickly, efficiently, talking to each other in the shorthand of people who have done something together hundreds of times without needing to perform it. Outside, the 6 other bikers had walked their machines fully off the highway shoulder and parked them along the edge of the field. They stood in a loose group, helmets in hand, watching the house. Dwayne had crossed the field and stood at the fence, tracking whatever he could make out through the open front door. He was not a man who expressed much on his face as a general policy, but his eyes were attentive, and his posture was the posture of someone who is prepared to be useful if asked. The neighborhood had begun to wake up in earnest. Margaret Foley had come down off her porch. She stood near the fence now, with her phone still in her hand, the call she'd never placed still unmade. She was watching the line of bikes and the men standing beside them, and the thing on her face was not exactly the alarm it had been 20 minutes ago. It was something more complicated, something that involved the recognition that she had picked up her phone and not dialed. Kezia Webb, 28, who worked nights at the hospital in Lebanon and had gotten home barely an hour ago, appeared in her doorway across the street in her scrubs and bare feet, took in the full scene with the rapid clinical read of someone trained to assess situations quickly, and walked out to the fence. "What happened?" she asked Dwayne. "Lady had a stroke. Kid got us off the highway." Kezia looked at the house, then at the line of bikes, then at Dwayne's face, which was open and matter-of-fact in a way she hadn't anticipated from a man of his size and appearance at 7:30 in the morning. "She going to make it? Paramedics are working her. She has a pulse." He paused. Kid held her hand the whole time, waiting. Kezia pressed her lips together and nodded slowly. She crossed her arms against the September chill and stayed where she was. At 7:44, the stretcher came out the front door. Carol was conscious by then. Not fully, not speaking clearly, but her eyes were open and tracking. One hand moved weakly against the stretcher rail. Lily, who had followed the gurney as far as the doorway, stepped out onto the porch and then down the steps alongside it, walking as close as they would allow. Carol's eyes found her. "I'll come see you," Lily told her, loud and clear, no wobble in it. "I'll bring Captain." One corner of Carol's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more complicated than a smile, something that contained loss and surprise and a feeling that might have been gratitude, but was also larger than that word. Then the paramedics lifted the stretcher into the ambulance, and Pete climbed in after them, and the doors closed, and Lily stood on the bottom porch step and watched the ambulance pull away. Rex was standing to the side of the porch. He had remained through all of it, not making himself known, not inserting himself, just present in the way that some people know how to be present without claiming space they haven't been offered. He was about to walk back toward the field when Lily's voice reached him. "Why did you stop?" He turned. She was looking at him with the same directness she'd used when she'd asked him if Carol was going to be okay, as though she had decided early and permanently that he was someone who would answer her honestly. "You were standing in the road," he said. "I know, but other cars didn't stop." She tilted her head slightly. "You stopped." Rex was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his boots, then back up at her. "I have a daughter," he said. "About your age. If she was standing in the middle of a road trying to get help for somebody, I'd want someone to stop for her." Lily considered this with the focused attention she gave to things she considered worth understanding fully. "Does she know that you do that?" she asked. "Stop for people?" The question hit Rex in a place he hadn't expected anything to reach that morning. He had no ready answer. He found, to his own surprise, that he didn't want to give her a quick one. "I'm not sure she does," he said honestly, "but maybe she should." By now, a small group had gathered near the fence on the Birch Street side. Margaret Foley had walked all the way over. Pete Garfield had returned from seeing the ambulance off, his shoulders carrying something between guilt and grief. Kezia still stood in her bare feet on the dry September grass. The Pattersons from the corner house, a middle-aged couple who had exchanged perhaps 2 words with Carol in 3 years, were standing quietly near the gap in the fence through which Lily had run 47 minutes ago. Dwayne, stepping up behind Rex, spoke in a low voice. "We should probably get moving, boss." Rex nodded once. He looked at the small group gathered in the early morning light, at the pale yellow house with the open front door, at the ceramic rooster still visible on the windowsill through the glass. He raised his voice slightly so the gathered neighbors could hear him plainly. "Before we go," he said, "somebody ought to check on that lady regular, not just when something goes wrong. He said it without accusation, without edge, plain and direct, the way things that need to be said ought to be said. She's been there for 30 years. Shouldn't take a 7-year-old running into traffic for her neighbors to know she's alive. Nobody replied immediately, but nobody looked away either, and several of them, in the silence that followed, looked at the yellow house in a way that was different from how they had looked at it before. Rex put his hand out toward Lily. She shook it with both hands, the way very young children shake hands when they mean it, formally, completely, like signing something important. "Thank you, Lily Harper," he said. She looked up at him. "You knew my name." "Pete told me." A corner of his mouth moved. "You done good today, kid." Carol Simmons spent 11 days at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville before being transferred to a rehabilitation facility in Lebanon, 12 miles from Clarkfield. The stroke had affected her left side, her arm and hand in particular, and her speech came back slowly, word by careful word, like someone rebuilding a wall one stone at a time. But it came back. On the 3rd day after the transfer, Lily made her mother drive her to the rehab facility after school. She brought Captain, the ceramic rooster, wrapped carefully in a dish towel for the trip, and placed him on the windowsill beside Carol's bed with the same decisive authority she applied to most things. "So you have something to look at," Lily explained. Carol looked at the rooster, then at Lily. Her right hand found Lily's wrist and held it. "Home," Carol said. It was one of the clearest words she had. She said it like a question and a statement at the same time. "I know," Lily said. "We're working on it." We had become, in the 11 days since the morning on Birch Street, a word with considerably larger meaning than it had carried before. Margaret Foley had organized the neighborhood check-in rotation. Nothing formal, just a shared text group, and a simple agreement that someone would confirm Carol's lights and collect her mail every day once she came home. Margaret had done it quietly, without announcement or ceremony, and without making anyone feel obligated to explain why they hadn't thought to do it before. The past didn't need to be narrated, it just needed to stop. Pete Garfield had taken on coordinating with Carol's daughter in Oregon, who had flown out the day after the stroke and spent a week at the rehabilitation facility looking stunned, not at her mother's condition, which the doctors had explained thoroughly, but at the fact that she was hearing, for the first time, genuine concern from the neighbors on Birch Street. "She never told us anyone looked out for her," the daughter said one afternoon, sitting in the hallway outside Carol's room, not as an accusation, but as a kind of grief. "That's because we didn't," Pete had replied. He said it plainly, and the hallway went quiet around the words for a long moment. Sandra Harper had taken the morning of the stroke off work. The distribution center manager had been, to her mild surprise, completely understanding, and had sat with Lily in their kitchen and listened to every detail of what had happened. She had not scolded Lily for running to the highway alone. She had considered it briefly, the way a responsible parent considers things, and then looked at her daughter's face, still carrying the particular steadiness that had carried her across a field and into a stranger's house and onto a highway full of motorcycles, and understood that there are children and there are children, and that some conversations require listening first and everything else second. "You were scared," Sandra said when Lily finished. "Yes," Lily said, "but you went anyway." She needed help. Lily looked at her mother with complete patience, the way she looked at things she considered obvious. "You go when someone needs help, even if you're scared. That's what you always say." Sandra Harper, who had indeed said this, in various forms on various mornings while tying shoes and packing lunches and driving to school, never entirely certain it was landing, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Yeah," she said finally, "that is what I say. Rex Calloway called 3 days after the incident. He had gotten Sandra's number from Pete, who had gotten it from a sequence of small-town information sharing that had required 3 conversations and 1 unexpected act of trust. The kind of trust that small communities sometimes discover they still have in the moments when they need it. Rex asked about Carol. He asked about Lily. His voice on the phone was the same as it had been in Carol's kitchen, careful, direct, stripped of unnecessary weight. Sandra thanked him. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say at all. "Lily asked me if your daughter knows that you stop for people." A silence on the line. "I heard she asked you that too," Sandra said. "She did," Rex said. "Did you have an answer yet?" Another silence, shorter. "Working on it." That weekend, Rex drove back to Clarkfield alone. No group, just his bike and the Highway 70 turnoff he had almost never taken. He knocked on the Harper's door. Sandra answered, and the look on her face cycled quickly from surprise through assessment and arrived at something cautious but genuinely open. Lily appeared at her mother's elbow half a second later. "You came back," Lily said. It was not a question. It had the quality of a confirmation. "Thought I'd let you know how the route looks from the other direction," he said. She hadn't asked him to do this, and he hadn't told her he would, but she accepted it without argument, because 7-year-olds who have already stopped 8 motorcycles with their bare hands tend not to be thrown by unexpected visits. He stayed for an hour. They sat on the porch in the afternoon light. Lily on the top step, Rex on the low wooden chair that listed slightly to the left. Sandra with 2 cups of coffee and a glass of juice appearing without announcement. Rex answered Lily's questions about the roads, about his club, about the Steel Valley Riders and their monthly volunteer work at the Veterans Center in Knoxville, about Maya. He talked about Maya with the particular careful honesty of someone who has recently looked at something squarely that he'd been looking away from for a while. When he stood to go, he looked at the pale yellow house next door, still quiet and waiting. "She coming home?" he asked Sandra. "Mid-November, they think. The neighbors are going to help get it ready, make it easier for her to manage on her own." Rex nodded slowly, looking at the front steps with their standard rise. "If she needs a ramp for the steps, I know people who build them. Veterans organization out of Knoxville. They do it for seniors too. No charge." Sandra looked at him for a moment. "I'll let Pete know." He nodded. He put on his helmet. Lily had come off the porch and was standing in the yard. "Will you come back?" she asked. He looked at her in the afternoon light, this small, serious person in a purple jacket who had stood in the middle of a highway and changed the geometry of his Thursday morning, and in ways he was still working out, something larger than that. He thought about the phone call he'd made that Saturday before driving here, the one to Maya he'd been putting off for reasons he couldn't fully defend anymore. Maya had answered on the second ring. They'd talked for 45 minutes, the longest they had in over a year. She'd laughed twice. The second time, he'd recognized the sound. "We come through here first Saturday of each month," he said. "Knoxville to Nashville route." Lily looked at him steadily. "I know where to find you then." "You do," he agreed. He rode out of Clarkfield the way he'd arrived, east on Highway 70. But at the edge of town, for the first time in years of passing through, he looked left. Carol Simmons came home on November 14th, a Thursday, to a house that had been cleaned, stocked with 2 weeks of groceries, and fitted with a new handrail on the front steps and a low ramp alongside them. Pete had organized the food. Margaret and Kezia had done the cleaning and had spent a Saturday afternoon moving furniture to widen the paths through the rooms in ways that would matter when Carol's left arm was still finding its way back. The ramp had been installed the previous weekend by 2 men from a Knoxville veterans organization who had arrived at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, worked for 4 hours in the mild November air, and left a simple card from the Steel Valley Riders. "Welcome home." The neighborhood came out to watch her arrive, Not all of them, but more than there would have been 6 weeks ago. More than there would have been for any occasion on Birch Street in recent memory. Carol came up her front walk in a wheelchair, her daughter pushing her slowly, her right hand resting on the armrest, and her left hand resting in her lap, where it was slowly, day by day, being persuaded back into service. She looked at the handrail. She looked at the ramp. She looked at the faces arranged along the walk and in the yards around her. Her speech was still careful, still deliberate, each word chosen and placed with the focused effort of someone who has been reminded not to take language for granted. "Thank you," she said to the street. And then, because she was Carol Simmons and had spent 60 years paying attention when most people didn't bother, all of you, Lily was standing at the end of her own porch, watching. Carol's eyes found her across the short distance of 2 yards, and Carol lifted her right hand, slowly, with visible effort, a gesture that had required deliberate physical work to produce. A small wave, unmistakable. Lily raised her hand and waved back. On the first Saturday of December, 8 motorcycles turned off Highway 70 onto the Birch Street access road and parked along the field's edge, engines falling quiet one by one, like a sentence ending. Rex Calloway came through the gap in the fence first, same as before. But this time the porch was full. Sandra with a pot of coffee, Pete with folding chairs he'd carried from his garage, Margaret with a plate of something covered in foil, Kezia in her off-day jeans, the Pattersons from the corner, and Carol Simmons in her wheelchair on her own front walk, Captain the ceramic rooster, visible through her window as he'd been since the morning this all started. Lily ran across the yard to meet Rex at the fence. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the porch, toward the people, toward the noise and the warmth and the folding chairs and the sound of a neighborhood discovering, belatedly and completely, that it was one. Rex Calloway, who had spent 12 years riding past towns without looking left, looked left, and found that there was a great deal worth seeing.